This video will talk through how you may want to approach a question on the future in an inspector calls. As always, these are just suggestions. There are plenty of different quotations that you could use or examples to be used that link to future. But here's my advice. I think the areas that you might potentially want to focus on are the exciting events in the future of the Birling family. So we've got Sheila's engagement, we've got with that greater prosperity, business looks good. So everything seems very bright and hopeful for the Birlings. And we'll look at what that might reflect about the lives of the upper class or the lives of capitalists at that time. Then looking at Mr. Birling's predictions of, for instance, the Titanic, Union uprisings, peacetime, and so on, and how that kind of reveals or exposes his ignorance and his lack of social understanding of that time. And then eventually I would end on looking at the inspector and his appeal for change. And that comes really from that speech that predicts an apocalyptic future for humanity. And what is the larger appeal for the audience from that? So some overall arguments that you might want to consider, and this is something that you might include in your introduction, and then for the main body paragraphs keep feeding back into these overall arguments. So the Birling's perceived secure future, is that really Priestley's way of highlighting the luxury of the upper class, okay? But the fact that we know that actually they don't have a secure future tells us or foreshadows that this luxury that they have, this security that they typically had, is soon to end. The fact that Mr. Birling's predictions are hugely inaccurate shows kind of the ignorance and the arrogance of the upper class, and the inspector's warnings that a failure to change will result in fire and blood and anguish really encourages us to review the status quo to ensure change. So remember, this was written in 1945. Priestley wants the audience to reflect on the society in which they live then and which they lived previously, and really consider, is this right for our future? So he's really encouraging people to review the status quo. Okay, so let's have a look. So here are some quotations you might look at. For instance, the Birling's future. How do we know that everything looks so bright and shiny for the Birlings? Well, first of all, it's Sheila's engagement. She's due to marry Gerald Croft, someone from a high social standing. And so this will be great for business for Mr. Birling. As he says, your engagement to Sheila means a tremendous lot to me. Remember to mention the use of personal pronoun here. He's not happy for his daughter. He doesn't care if Gerald's going to treat her well. He cares about how this will bring him and his business prosperity. And he goes on to support this. We may look forward to the time when Crofts and Birlings are no longer competing, but are working together for lower costs and higher prices. And so what we're seeing here is the security of capitalists at this time. They had enjoyed a long time of security, and so this might seem quite arrogant from Mr. Birling. But it's because this is the luxury of security that the upper class or the capitalist world had been enjoying for a very long time by 1912. So there's a sense of invincibility amongst the Birling household at this point. Everything just looks wonderful. But there is a little bit of foreshadowing here. So you might talk about the fact that Sheila is entering into a marriage which is, at least for like 1912, you might argue is kind of a patriarchal structure. We hear her mother, Sybil Birling, telling her, you know, you're going to have to get used to the fact that you're not going to see Gerald often. He's going to have to give all his time and effort to his business. So there's a real dismissiveness of women And that's what Sheila's about to enter. But she says, I don't think I will. I don't think I will get used to that. So there is some foreshadowing there that Sheila's future will be different. She's not as willing as her mother was to enter this patriarchal structure that marriage at the time would have cemented. She's different, and we're definitely going to see that change in her. So we do already at the beginning see a hint that the future isn't quite as secure as maybe Sybil and Arthur think it is. And then moving on to Mr. Birling's predictions, many of you used these in your answers, and there's lots to choose from. So, for instance, he says we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity. The audience that would be watching know that there's going to be a great economic depression in the 1930s. What about war? Fiddlesticks. Well, there will be 2 wars by the time the audience watch this. He says that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. We know that it sinks on its first go. And you'll be living in a world that'll have forgotten all these capital versus labour agitations. Absolutely not. What comes with war is a rise in socialism and even more strikes. So regardless of which one you choose, obviously what you'll want to do is focus on some of the techniques that are used as well. So you can talk about the fact that he talks in declarative sentences. He speaks in monologues as well, so that's kind of his self-assurance, his confidence that he knows what's going to happen. He also interrupts, especially Eric. He interrupts Eric a lot, who raises some good points. Eric is the one that says, what about war? So there's a great arrogance to Mr. Birling. But overall, regardless of which ones that you choose, you want to talk about dramatic irony, because the audience at this time is an audience of 1945 or later. So they know that all these things that he says are impossible do happen. And so it really, the future in this sense, or Mr. Birling's predictions of the future, help to make him look really naive and ill-informed. And we start to lose respect for him, and he as a character loses credibility, because actually he has no idea what he's talking about. So later on in the play, when he is sticking to his guns and he's stubborn and he refuses to take responsibility, he's already lost credibility with the audience, so they're not going to side with his views. And then finally, we've got the inspector's warning. So at the end, he provides a monologue, and part of that he says, "And I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish." That should say blood, not bloody, sorry. So what is he doing here? He's appealing for change. Really what he's doing is speaking to Sybil and Arthur, especially at this point, because at this stage in the play, they are being very stubborn and not really taking responsibility. So what would you maybe focus on? I think, that's a really long quote. You won't want to remember all of that. So maybe just focus on fire and blood and anguish. Look at the syndetic listing, because we've got and rather than a comma here. And the syndetic listing emphasises the violent imagery of the individual words, fire, blood, anguish. And what is he referring to? You might argue he's referring to the 2 wars that will happen, that the Birlings have no idea about. That's ahead of them. And then look at Sheila and her observations of her parents. You began to learn something, and now you've stopped. You're ready to go on in the same old way. So she's very fearful about the fact that her parents are unwilling to change, and she starts to realise the great repercussions of not changing. So this is really a message not for the parents. This is Priestley's message to the audience. We must reflect on the way that we behave, the way that our society is. We must change if we want things to move forward, if we want our society to progress. Otherwise, we're going to end up in fire and blood and anguish. And what does that mean? Another war. So it was really, really a warning for the audience. And then I would definitely comment on the cyclical structure. So at the end, the play ends with they think they've been scammed and they've got away with it, and then they get a phone call, and Mr. Birling looks very shaken, and it says a police inspector is on his way here. So it's like the play is about to happen again, and the interrogation, similar to what Inspector Gould delivered during the play, is going to happen again. And what you might argue is that cyclical structure is really Priestley saying, if you don't change, we will just go through this again and again and again. We already have had 2 world wars, and we'll have a third if we don't change. Now is the time to stop and really think about our actions and how we can change the society that we live in. That's the way I would do it. There's loads of other ways of looking at it. There's loads of different quotations that you could explore. But this just gives you, I think, some nice different aspects of the play. So on one hand, you've got the security, or at least the perceived security of the Birlings, and how that reflects. They look forward to the future because they've always appreciated the luxury of security, which has come with being a capitalist, and capitalists sticking together and exploiting the poor. You've got the arrogance, then that's kind of linked with capitalism again, the arrogance that everything's going to be fine, because at this point Mr. Birling hasn't had to go through anything like this. But then eventually an appeal for change, and encouraging the audience, not just the characters, but the audience, to look into the future and what might their actions today how will their actions today affect the future